In August 1941, with German forces positioned for direct advance on Moscow, Adolf Hitler made a decision that would determine the outcome of the entire Soviet campaign. He ordered forces diverted south to encircle Kiev instead of continuing the Moscow offensive. Wehrmacht field commanders, including Heinz Guderian and other panzer group leaders, argued strenuously against the diversion. They calculated that German forces could reach Moscow in late August or early September if they maintained direct advance. Hitler rejected their arguments. He insisted that destroying Soviet forces around Kiev was more important than capturing Moscow quickly. That decision, to divert forces south when Moscow was vulnerable, consumed 5 critical weeks from the campaign timeline. When German forces finally launched the Moscow offensive in October, the weather window was closing. Professional military judgment said speed and timing mattered more than tactical encirclements. Political and operational stubbornness delayed the decisive operation until weather made success impossible. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, 6 weeks later than Wehrmacht planning had identified as optimal. The delay was caused by Balkans operations rescuing Italian failures in Greece and Yugoslavia. Professional planners had warned that starting in late June rather than early May would compress the timeline for reaching final objectives before winter. When Barbarossa launched, German forces had approximately 4 to 5 months of favorable weather for mobile operations. Wehrmacht operational calculations showed this was adequate but left no margin for delays or diversions. The timeline required maintaining continuous pressure and direct advances toward primary objectives. Any operational pauses or diversions would consume time that could not be recovered. By August, German forces had advanced rapidly and were positioned for final push toward Moscow. Professional military assessment was that immediate continuation toward Moscow was essential because weather window was finite. Every week consumed by operations other than Moscow advance was week lost from remaining favorable weather. The timeline that began tight was becoming critical. German field commanders who were actually conducting operations reached unanimous consensus in August, advanced directly on Moscow immediately. Guderian, Hoth, and other panzer commanders calculated that Soviet forces defending Moscow approaches were weakened and disorganized. They assessed that concentrated German armored thrust could break through and encircle Moscow within 3 to 4 weeks if launched immediately. The window was closing. Late August start would reach Moscow in late September before autumn rains significantly reduced mobility. Professional military judgment was that Moscow was decisive objective. Capturing Soviet capital would disrupt command and control, threaten regime survival, and potentially force Soviet collapse or negotiated settlement. Kiev and other objectives were tactically significant but not strategically decisive. Field commanders presented these assessments through command channels. They argued that destroying Soviet field armies was less important than capturing Moscow while weather and timeline permitted. Their consensus was based on operational reality. They were at the front and could see what was possible. The professional military assessment from commanders conducting operations was clear: Moscow now, or risk losing the weather window entirely. Hitler rejected field commanders' Moscow recommendations. His reasoning was operational and ideological. Operationally, he wanted to destroy Soviet field armies through encirclement rather than allowing them to retreat. Large Soviet forces remained around Kiev. Encircling and destroying these forces would eliminate organized Soviet resistance in southern sector. Ideologically, Hitler prioritized capturing Ukraine's agricultural and industrial resources over taking Moscow. He argued that economic objectives mattered more than symbolic capital. When field commanders objected that Moscow was strategically more important than Kiev, Hitler dismissed their concerns. He insisted that his strategic vision was correct and that professional military advice was too narrowly focused on operational considerations without understanding broader economic and political factors. The decision was final. German forces that could have been advancing on Moscow in late August were diverted south to encircle Kiev. Professional military judgment about timing and strategic priorities was overruled by political leadership's assessment that economic encirclements mattered more than capital capture. The diversion would consume 5 weeks. September was lost to Kiev operation that field commanders said was secondary to Moscow objective. German forces executed Kiev Encirclement brilliantly. The operation captured over 600,000 Soviet troops in one of history's largest encirclement battles. Tactically, it was masterpiece. Operationally, it consumed exactly the time field commanders had warned about. The Kiev operation took from late August through late September. When it concluded, October had arrived. German forces could now return to Moscow offensive, but 5 critical weeks were gone. Weather was already deteriorating. Autumn rains had begun. Roads were turning to mud. Mobility was reduced. Wehrmacht field commanders who had opposed Kiev diversion noted bitterly that they had been correct about timing. The tactical success at Kiev had strategic cost. September's favorable weather was spent on encirclement that did not bring Germany closer to Moscow. Professional assessment had been that Moscow mattered more than any encirclement. Time proved them right. Kiev victory was celebrated, but the cost was 5 weeks of campaign timeline that could not be recovered. When German forces finally turned toward Moscow in October, they were doing so in exactly the unfavorable conditions that field commanders had warned would result from delay. Operation Typhoon, the Moscow offensive, launched on October 2, 1941. German forces attacked toward Moscow with determination. Initial advances were successful. Soviet defenses were penetrated. But weather was already problematic. October rains created mud that slowed mobility. Tank and vehicle movement was significantly reduced. Supply became difficult as roads deteriorated. Wehrmacht planners calculated that if Moscow offensive had begun in late August as field commanders recommended, current position would have been reached in mid-September with better weather. The 5-week delay for Kiev meant operations were occurring in October conditions rather than late summer conditions. Professional field assessment had warned exactly this would happen. The timing margin was gone. German forces were racing deteriorating weather and Soviet reinforcements. Every day brought worse conditions and stronger Soviet resistance. Hitler's decision to prioritize Kiev encirclement in August had consumed the 5 weeks that field commanders calculated were necessary for Moscow capture before weather turned completely unfavorable. The offensive was beginning with advantages already eroded. German forces advanced toward Moscow throughout October despite mud and rain. Tactical skill remained high. Soviet forces were defeated in several engagements. By late October, German forces had penetrated Soviet defensive lines and were approaching Moscow's outer defenses. But progress was slower than planned. Weather was primary factor. Roads were nearly impassable. Supply columns could not keep pace with advancing forces. Ammunition and fuel were arriving slowly. Wehrmacht operational staff calculated that advance rate was approximately half what it had been in summer conditions. If weather had been favorable, German forces would already be at Moscow. Instead, they were approaching it slowly through increasingly difficult conditions. Professional planners noted that 5-week earlier start would have completed operations before mud season. October advance was exactly what field commanders had warned about: an August operation occurring in deteriorating conditions because delay consumed favorable weather. Hitler had insisted Kiev was more important than timing. German forces approaching Moscow and mud were demonstrating that professional assessment about whether timing had been correct. In mid-November, weather shifted from rain and mud to cold and snow. Temperatures dropped rapidly. German forces lacked winter equipment because planners had assumed campaign would be completed before winter. The cold created new problems beyond mobility. Weapons malfunctioned in extreme temperatures. Vehicles would not start. Frostbite became a serious issue. German casualties from weather were significant. Soviet forces were better equipped for winter conditions and began counterattacking more effectively. Wehrmacht operational assessments noted that German forces were fighting winter war without winter preparation. Professional planners had warned that starting Barbarossa in June rather than May would push operations into winter. Hitler's Kiev diversion had further delayed Moscow offensive by 5 weeks. The cumulative delays meant German forces were at Moscow in November rather than September. November was winter. September would have been late summer. The professional assessment about weather timing was proving catastrophically accurate. German forces were within sight of Moscow but could not function effectively in winter conditions. The timing margins that professional judgment identified as critical were not exaggerated, they were precise. While German forces struggled with weather and supply, Soviet reinforcements were arriving from Siberia. Stalin had maintained substantial forces in Far East to guard against potential Japanese attack. Soviet intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack, allowing transfer of these forces to Moscow defense. Fresh Siberian divisions began arriving in November. These were well-trained, fully equipped units accustomed to winter fighting. Wehrmacht intelligence tracked these arrivals with growing concern. Professional field commanders noted that if Moscow offensive had occurred in August as they recommended, these reinforcements would not have arrived yet. 5-week delay for Kiev operation provided time for Soviet reinforcements to reach Moscow. German forces approaching Moscow in November faced stronger Soviet defense than would have existed in September. Every warning about timing was materializing simultaneously: unfavorable weather, inadequate German winter equipment, and Soviet reinforcements all arriving because delays consumed the time window when German advantages existed. Hitler's decision to prioritize Kiev Encirclement in August had given Soviets exactly the time they needed to strengthen Moscow defenses. In early December, German forces launched final attempt to capture Moscow. Advanced units reached points within 5 miles of Kremlin. This was closest German forces would ever get. They could see Moscow's buildings, but they could not advance further. Soviet defenses had strengthened. Winter conditions were severe. German forces were exhausted and undersupplied. Wehrmacht field commanders reported that units were at operational limits. On December 5, Soviet counteroffensive began. Fresh Siberian divisions attacked German positions. German forces were pushed back from Moscow. Wehrmacht operational staff calculated that if Moscow offensive had begun in late August as field commanders recommended, German forces would have reached this position in September with better weather, before Soviet reinforcements arrived, and with adequate supplies. Coming 5 miles short in December rather than capturing Moscow in September was direct result of timing delays: Balkans Campaign delaying Barbarossa start, then Kiev diversion consuming 5 weeks in August-September. Professional military judgment about timing requirements had been precise. 5 miles in 5 weeks were the margin of failure. Soviet winter counteroffensive pushed German forces back from Moscow throughout December and January. Wehrmacht was forced into defensive positions. The Moscow offensive had failed. Professional military analysis of failure was straightforward. Timing delays eliminated German advantages and created conditions favoring Soviet defense. Specifically, 6-week delay from Balkans Campaign plus 5-week delay from Kiev diversion meant Moscow offensive occurred in November rather than August, an 11-week difference. August weather would have been favorable. November weather was catastrophic for German operations. August would have been before Soviet Siberian reinforcements arrived. November gave Soviets time to strengthen defenses. Professional field commanders who recommended immediate Moscow offensive in August had been correct about every consequence of delay. Hitler's decision to prioritize Kiev Encirclement had consumed precisely the time margin that professional assessment identified as necessary for success. The retreat from Moscow was not result of Soviet military superiority, it was result of strategic and operational decisions that consumed time advantages and created unfavorable conditions. German forces lost Moscow not because they fought poorly, but because delays placed them at decisive objective under worst possible conditions. Wehrmacht post-operation analysis examined why Moscow offensive failed. Professional military staff who had opposed timing delays were vindicated in every assessment. They had warned Balkans Campaign would delay Barbarossa beyond safe weather window, it did. They had warned starting in June rather than May would compress timeline, it did. Field commanders had warned that Kiev diversion would consume critical weeks, it consumed 5 weeks. They had warned that November offensive would face unfavorable weather and Soviet reinforcements, both materialized. Every professional military assessment about timing requirements proved accurate. The analysis documented specific decisions that consumed time. Political choice to rescue Italy in Balkans cost 6 weeks, operational choice to prioritize Kiev Encirclement cost 5 weeks. These 11 weeks represented difference between Moscow operation in August versus November. Professional military judgment had correctly identified that weather and timing mattered more than tactical considerations. Analysis showed that German forces possessed adequate tactical capability to capture Moscow, but timing decisions placed them at the objective under conditions making success impossible. The professional military assessments that were overruled by political and operational decisions were precisely correct about consequences. Military historians analyzing Moscow campaign consistently examine counterfactual, what if professional military timing recommendations had been followed? Start Barbarossa in early May as planned rather than delaying for Balkans, German forces reach August positions in early July. Advance directly on Moscow in late July rather than diverting to Kiev, Moscow offensive begins in August. German forces reach Moscow in September with favorable weather, adequate supplies, and before Siberian reinforcements arrive. Would this guarantee German victory? Soviet resources were enormous and will to resist was strong. But conditions would have been dramatically more favorable than November reality. German forces came within 5 miles of Moscow despite operating under worst possible conditions. Operating under optimal conditions might have been sufficient for capture. The counterfactual is not speculation, it is calculation based on known advance rates and weather data. Professional military staff recommended specific timeline that would have placed German forces at Moscow in September. Political and operational decisions consumed 11 weeks from that timeline. Those 11 weeks were difference between favorable conditions for success versus unfavorable conditions causing failure. Germany had choice to follow professional timing recommendations. Political leadership chose differently. Moscow campaign exemplifies recurring pattern in German strategic operations. professional military expertise correctly identifying requirements and consequences, but political and operational leadership making decisions overriding professional judgment. Wehrmacht planners said Barbarossa needed May start, Hitler delayed 6 weeks for Balkans. Field commanders said advance directly on Moscow in August, Hitler ordered Kiev diversion consuming 5 weeks. Professional assessments were accurate about every consequence, whether timing, Soviet reinforcements, operational conditions. But accuracy did not influence decisions made on political considerations or operational stubbornness. The pattern was systematic. Professional expertise existed at every level: strategic planning, operational command, tactical execution. But decision-making authority rested with political leadership unwilling to subordinate other considerations to professional military assessment of what operations required. Germany did not lack expertise about weather timing, campaign planning, or operational priorities. Germany lacked decision-making structure that implemented professional expertise when it conflicted with political objectives or leadership preferences. Moscow was lost not because professional advice was wrong, it was lost because professional advice was systematically ignored in favor of decisions serving non-military priorities. When historians assess German failure at Moscow, timing delays are identified as decisive factor. German forces possessed tactical capability to capture Moscow. They proved this by coming within 5 miles despite catastrophic conditions. They lacked the timing advantages that professional military judgment said were necessary for success. Those advantages were consumed by strategic and operational decisions that professional expertise opposed. Balkans Campaign delayed Barbarossa 6 weeks against unanimous Wehrmacht planning opposition. Kiev diversion consumed 5 weeks against unanimous field commander recommendations. These 11 weeks placed Moscow offensive in November rather than August, the difference between favorable conditions and impossible conditions. Professional military staff who opposed these decisions were completely correct about consequences. Their warnings were not exaggerated pessimism, they were accurate operational assessment. Germany lost Moscow not because Soviet forces were invincible or because German forces were inadequate. Germany lost Moscow because political decisions about Italian alliance and operational decisions about encirclement priorities consumed the time margins that professional military assessment identified as essential for success. The Battle of Moscow was lost by decisions made in Berlin in March and August, not by soldiers fighting outside the city in December. Professional military expertise correctly identified what was required. Political and operational decision-making prevented implementing that expertise until conditions made success impossible.